The morning sky over Tokyo had never witnessed such terror. April 18, 1942, began like any other day in the Japanese capital. Children prepared for school. Workers headed to their jobs. The war felt distant and safe. Then the sound came. Engine noise, where no engines should be. American bombers roared overhead. The impossible had become reality. How had these aircraft reached the heart of Japan? Why did this single mission send tremors through an empire that believed itself untouchable? The answers lay 4 months earlier in Pearl Harbor's smoke and flames. December 7, 1941, had shattered American confidence. Battleships rested on the harbor floor. Thousands of sailors lay dead. The Pacific Fleet seemed broken beyond repair. Japan's empire stretched across the ocean like an iron fist. Victory after victory had followed Pearl Harbor. The Philippines fell. Malaya crumbled. Burma collapsed. Singapore surrendered. Australia trembled under threat. Japan's military machine appeared unstoppable. Yet on that April morning, 16 bombers materialized over Tokyo. These were B-25 Mitchell aircraft. Medium bombers too large for carrier decks, too heavy for such impossible distances, too far from any friendly airfield to survive the journey home. But there they were, flying boldly over the Emperor's palace, dropping bombs on sacred soil, proving that America was far from defeated. Each explosion carried more than destructive force. Each blast delivered a message written in fire and thunder. The United States would strike back, no matter the cost, no matter the odds. The crews flying these aircraft knew the truth. They would not return to their carrier. They might not survive the day. Fuel would run short. Safety lay hundreds of miles away across hostile territory. This was a one-way mission, a gamble with death itself. Yet not one man hesitated when volunteers were called. What drove these airmen to attempt the impossible? What made this raid echo across the Pacific with such force that it changed the entire war? President Franklin Roosevelt faced a crisis of confidence in early 1942. Pearl Harbor had stunned the nation into silence. Fear gripped American hearts. Whispers of Japanese invincibility filled every newspaper. Roosevelt needed more than words to rally his people. He needed proof. Visible proof that America could reach across the vast Pacific and strike the enemy homeland. But how could a wounded nation accomplish such a feat? No bomber possessed the range to fly from American soil to Japan and return. No airfield lay close enough to launch such an attack. The solution came from an unlikely source. James Harold Doolittle was more than a military officer. He was an aviation pioneer who had broken speed records and performed blind flights using only instruments. When presented with the impossible challenge, Doolittle's response was direct. It could be done. The question was how. The Pacific Ocean in 1942 belonged entirely to Japan. Its naval forces controlled island chains like stepping stones. Its armies advanced on every front. China lay under brutal occupation. The Philippines fought their final battles. Against this backdrop, even dreaming of bombing Tokyo seemed like madness. Yet madness was precisely what Roosevelt's advisors believed necessary. They needed a psychological blow, not measured in tons of explosives, but in shock value. They needed to remind Americans that their enemy could bleed. They needed Japanese citizens to question their leaders' promises of safety. Doolittle proposed using the North American B-25 Mitchell. This medium bomber had never been designed for carrier operations, but it offered something heavier aircraft could not provide: the ability to lift off from shorter runways while still carrying a meaningful payload. If the Army Air Forces and Navy could cooperate, the unthinkable might become possible. The plan was as dangerous as it was brilliant. Load 16 bombers onto an aircraft carrier, sail within striking distance of Japan, launch them into the unknown. Trust that crews would somehow reach safety in China after dropping their bombs. There would be no return to the carrier, no rescue possible in the open Pacific. Every volunteer understood what was asked of them. They were not expected to win a decisive battle. They were asked to give hope to millions of Americans who had lost faith in victory. The raid would not cripple Japan's war machine. It would not end the conflict. But it would prove that the enemy homeland was not beyond American reach. From Pearl Harbor's devastation rose desperate determination. In that determination, the Doolittle raid was conceived. Selecting the right aircraft posed the first major obstacle. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress were too massive. Their wingspans exceeded carrier deck width. Their takeoff distances were impossibly long for naval operations. Fighter aircraft, though agile, lacked the range to cross vast ocean distances between an American task force and Japan's coastline. Only the B-25 Mitchell offered even remote possibility. Compact and sturdy with medium-range capabilities, it had never been designed for carrier flight. Yet necessity demanded innovation. Doolittle and his team began intensive experimentation. Could the Mitchell become airborne in less than 500 feet? Could it rise from a heaving carrier deck at sea? Training grounds across the United States witnessed pilots learning to coax their bombers skyward with knife-edge precision. Engines screamed at maximum throttle. Landing gear left runways with yards to spare. Every successful trial brought them closer to making the impossible possible. Volunteer crews came from every corner of the Air Force. Initially, they were told almost nothing, only that the mission would be dangerous, unprecedented, and absolutely secret. Not a single airman declined the opportunity. The mystery itself, combined with the chance to strike back at Japan, proved irresistible. They trained in complete silence, practicing short runway takeoffs, rehearsing navigation over open water, preparing for the long, lonely hours they would face after releasing their bombs. Meanwhile, the Navy prepared its crucial role. The USS Hornet, barely commissioned, would serve as their unlikely launching platform. Her deck would carry 16 B-25s arranged wingtip to wingtip. Their frames towered over the slender fighters normally stationed there. No one had ever attempted such a dangerous feat. Many naval officers considered it pure madness. But those watching Roosevelt's determined expression understood that madness was exactly what the situation required. Every detail was calculated to the edge of failure. Bomb loads were reduced to save weight. Fuel tanks were extended for maximum range. Defensive guns were stripped down or replaced with wooden replicas. Each modification whispered the same harsh truth. These men were being prepared for a mission where survival was unlikely. Yet morale remained unshakable. The crews understood they might never see home again. But if they succeeded, they would carry America's banner directly over Japan's capital. They would remind the world that Pearl Harbor was not the end of America's story. By early April 1942, preparations were complete. 16 bombers were hoisted aboard the Hornet in San Francisco Bay. On her deck, the massive machines looked like caged giants. Sailors stared in disbelief at the hulking aircraft occupying space where fragile fighters normally rested. Ahead lay the Pacific Ocean. Beyond it, the heart of the Japanese Empire. The USS Hornet sliced through Pacific swells, with her deck crowded by bombers that belonged to another world. Every sailor understood the mission's magnitude. None could predict the dangers ahead. On the morning of April 18th, disaster struck before the task force reached its intended launch point. Japanese patrol vessels spotted the American fleet. Warning signals raced toward Tokyo. The element of surprise was evaporating. Admiral William Halsey faced an impossible choice. The bombers would have to launch immediately, hundreds of miles farther from Japan than originally planned. This decision sealed the aircrew's fate. Fuel would run dangerously short. Reaching safety in China became far less certain. Still, there was no hesitation among the volunteers. Orders were issued. Engines roared to life across the carrier deck. One by one, the B-25 Mitchells rolled forward on the narrow platform. Waves crashed against the bow. Wind tore across the sea. Each pilot confronted the same terrifying reality. There was no runway beyond the carrier's edge. It was sky or water, flight or death. The first bomber lunged forward with engines straining and wheels rattling against wooden planks. For agonizing seconds, it seemed too heavy, its nose dipping as the deck ended and ocean opened beneath. Then, at the last possible moment, the aircraft lifted, climbing into gray morning skies. Cheers erupted from the crew, but tension never dissipated. 15 more bombers would have to repeat this miracle. One after another, the aircraft leaped into the air. Some clawed skyward with mere feet to spare. Others bounced low over waves, skimming the sea before finding lift. Every launch was a gamble with gravity and death. Every success carried them closer to Tokyo and farther from any hope of return. The men inside the aircraft sat in tense silence, gripping controls and staring into endless water. They understood the mathematics of their situation. They knew their fuel would not last for a return journey. Yet not a single bomber turned back toward safety. Behind them, the Hornet continued westward, her deck now empty of its unusual cargo. Her crew watched until the last silhouette vanished into the distant horizon. What they had witnessed was more than courage. It was a farewell. 16 planes flying toward Japan's heart with no promise of survival. Hours of silence passed as the B-25s thundered low over the Pacific, hugging the waves to avoid detection, conserving every precious drop of fuel. Crews stared at endless water, their thoughts circling the same harsh truth. There would be no way back to safety. Then Japan's coastline rose from morning mist. It was the moment they had trained for relentlessly, the moment America had prayed for desperately. Tokyo was serene that morning. Children walked peacefully to school. Workers hurried to their factory jobs. Smoke curled lazily from residential chimneys. The war seemed impossibly distant until the drone of aircraft engines swept over rooftops. Eyes turned upward in stunned disbelief. American bombers, over the sacred capital itself. The first bombs tumbled free with fins whistling as they fell toward the city's heart. Explosions ripped through Tokyo's districts. Fire blossomed in waves of orange and black destruction. Flames licked toward the sky. Windows shattered from the concussions. The ground trembled beneath stunned civilian feet. For the first time in centuries, foreign forces were attacking the Japanese homeland. The bombers pressed onward with deadly purpose. Some struck Yokohama's port facilities. Others targeted Nagoya's industrial centers. Still more hit Kobe's strategic installations. Oil depots erupted in towering columns of smoke. Factory buildings shuddered under explosive impacts. Military installations, though only lightly damaged, felt the sting of national humiliation. Physical destruction was limited by the small bomb loads, but the psychological blow was immense and lasting. In the cockpit of the lead Mitchell, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle guided his bomber straight over Tokyo's center. Every second felt like an eternity of exposure. Anti-aircraft guns barked angrily from below. Shells burst in black puffs around the aircraft's wings. Searchlights stabbed desperately through morning skies. But the bombers pressed forward undeterred by enemy fire. Each explosion below signaled to the watching world that Japan's supposed invulnerability was nothing but myth. For the Japanese people, the raid felt completely surreal. They had been told repeatedly that the enemy was weak and distant, that the Pacific Ocean was an impenetrable shield. Yet here were American bombers flying brazenly above their neighborhood streets. Fear rippled through the startled population like electricity. Confidence in the war's inevitable victory began to crack and crumble. For the American crews, adrenaline surged with every racing heartbeat. They had struck the enemy capital successfully. They had fulfilled an impossible order against all odds. But, with each passing minute, fuel gauges dipped lower toward empty. The euphoria of successful attack gave way to growing dread. They were running out of sky, out of time, out of fuel, out of hope. Still, the primary mission was complete, beyond all expectations. 16 bombers had accomplished what the entire world thought unthinkable. Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe had all felt the reach of American military power. What had begun as a desperate gamble was now a thunderclap echoing across the Pacific. As the last bombs fell toward their targets, the planes turned westward toward the uncertain refuge of China. Behind them, the cities burned with American-made fires. Ahead of them, only darkness and uncertainty awaited. The raid was over, but the real ordeal had only begun. With fuel tanks approaching empty, the bombers clawed westward desperately, trying to reach China's coast. Night fell like a black curtain. Rain clouds gathered ominously. Visibility collapsed into absolute darkness. One by one, crews were forced to make impossible survival choices. Some bailed out over completely unfamiliar terrain. Parachutes snapped open in howling winds. Others landed violently in flooded rice fields or on rugged mountainsides. Not a single aircraft made it safely back to any friendly airfield. For many crews, the descent into China was pure chaos. Some men were badly injured during landing, stumbling into remote villages where frightened locals became unexpected rescuers. Others were hunted relentlessly by Japanese patrol units, captured, beaten savagely, and paraded as war trophies before jeering crowds. 8 raiders fell into brutal enemy hands. 3 would be executed as war criminals. 1 would die slowly in captivity from starvation and disease. The rest endured months of torture, interrogation, and brutal confinement before liberation arrived years later. But Americans were not the only ones who paid for the raid's success. Chinese people who helped the fallen raiders paid a terrible price. Japanese forces, enraged by Tokyo's bombing humiliation, unleashed savage campaigns of reprisal. Entire towns suspected of aiding Americans were burned to the ground. Tens of thousands of innocent civilians were slaughtered in brutal punishment campaigns. Women and children died because their countrymen had shown mercy to crashed airmen. The raid had struck Japan's national pride successfully, but it had also triggered suffering on a massive scale across occupied China. Back in the United States, however, news of the raid brought something the nation had not felt since Pearl Harbor's devastation: hope. Newspaper headlines screamed of bombers over Tokyo. Crowds cheered wildly in city streets. For the first time since war began, Americans could believe their enemy was truly vulnerable. Yet James Doolittle himself felt no triumph or satisfaction. Surveying the wreckage of lost planes, scattered crews, and the heavy toll on Chinese allies, he expected a court-martial. In his mind, the mission had failed completely. They had inflicted minimal material damage, sacrificed all their aircraft unnecessarily, left allies to suffer brutal consequences. What Doolittle could not yet understand was that his raid had delivered exactly what Roosevelt desperately needed. It had shown a wounded nation that it could still strike back effectively. It had forced Japan to divert precious military resources to homeland defense. Most importantly, it had planted the first seeds of doubt in minds that had been told defeat was impossible. 16 bombers had flown directly into history. Their impact would be measured not in physical craters or rubble, but in the shifting psychological tides of global war. The Doolittle raid created a legacy far greater than the smoke rising from Tokyo's burning districts. In purely military terms, actual damage had been quite limited. Factories were quickly repaired. Electrical power was rapidly restored. Industrial production barely slowed from the bombing. But in psychological terms, the strike hit like a thunderbolt across Japan. For the first time, ordinary Japanese people had seen their cities were vulnerable to attack. For the first time, their military leaders realized the sacred homeland itself was not beyond enemy reach. In Washington, the political effect was immediate and dramatic. The raid electrified a nation still mourning Pearl Harbor's devastating losses. Newsreels played images of smiling bomber crews. Headlines declared a daring blow against Japanese power. Americans who had doubted the future found their spirits suddenly lifted. It was living proof that courage could bridge impossible distances. It was demonstration that the United States would not simply defend. It would attack. For Japan, the raid carried heavy strategic consequences far beyond the immediate damage. Furious at the national humiliation, Japanese commanders shifted valuable resources to protect the homeland. Air defense systems were rapidly strengthened. Combat troops were pulled back from offensive operations. Most crucially, plans were accelerated to draw the American fleet into one decisive battle. That fateful decision would lead directly to Midway, where 4 irreplaceable Japanese aircraft carriers would be lost forever, where the tide of the entire Pacific War would begin its historic turn. James Doolittle did not face the court-martial he expected. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor from a grateful president. His men were celebrated as national heroes, living proof of what daring and determination could achieve against impossible odds. Yet even they admitted the human cost was staggering. The risks had been unbearable. The price in innocent lives was incalculable. Still, none doubted that their desperate mission had fundamentally changed history's course. The raid became an enduring symbol of American resilience, of defiance against overwhelming odds, of the unbreakable national will to fight back when defeat seemed absolutely certain. It reminded the entire world that wars are not won only with superior weapons and numbers. They are won with unshakable belief. Belief that the impossible can be attempted successfully. Belief that courage can ignite hope in the darkest hours. 16 bombers had flown into legend that April morning. Their flight path was written not on navigation maps, but in the hearts and memories of millions. From that historic day forward, the Pacific War would never again follow the same course. Japan's aura of invincibility was shattered forever. The raiders had proven that no target was beyond American reach. No enemy homeland was safe from retaliation. No attack on American soil would go unanswered. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States had delivered its response. Written in fire across Tokyo's morning sky. The message was unmistakable. America was wounded, but far from defeated. The long road to victory had begun.